Hello, everyone. I'm smiling because my colleague Liv Lee, who is, if you like, the sort of executive producer of the Tortoise Thinking, she is one of those Hollywood producer types who essentially pulls our strings. And while we think we have self-determination, she's the one that really is making it happen. Looked slightly worried as I came on this open news meeting today, because even as we were getting ready for our lunchtime thinking, I was trying to play the back end of the PMQs that are playing out in the House of Commons today. And I suppose what she caught me with was the very real problem of a very fast-moving news environment and a slow newsroom. And so I'm going to bring something very slow to today's discussion. About half a century ago, the then Labour leader Hugh Gateskill, after a Labour election victory, quoted, I think it was Oscar Wilde, in saying that Labour had adopted a position which was that the play was a success, but the audience was a failure. And it feels to me as though that's a nice way to enter into today's conversation. We have three really big subjects in front of us today. One is the way the government is now quite obviously spooked by the prospect of a second wave and is moving to a second different configuration of lockdown. Whether they're right, whether they're wrong, how they're communicating. The second is that although you may not feel it in the ways that you felt in the past, and many people never felt it at all, we are in the middle of an historic Labour Party conference, in as much as the Labour Party has a new leader who is in very real ways changing the terms of trade within his party and with the public. He's had enough, if you like, of saying that the party's a success and the public is a failure, and is arguing for something fundamentally different. And the third, although this also may feel far, far away, is the United Nations General Assembly is marking its 75th birthday, and the opening of debate at what would be the UN General Assembly today, but of course is doing so digitally. And so we have big questions: the handling of the pandemic, the role of the opposition, and the nature of global leadership. And I wanted to open by throwing those big subjects open, because it feels as though in the last few weeks we've begun to scratch at them, particularly the political handling of the pandemic and the nature of global leadership. My colleague Zav Greenwood is here marshalling the conversation. I tell you what I wanted to do is start, if we could, domestically. The reason for it is, if you look at where we are now, I hope you can see in SenseMaker. Oh my God, is my video not on? There it was. I thought it was on. I hope you can see me now. There we are. I want to start domestically if I can, because it feels to me as though there's a kind of rich seam here of subjects to look at. And when I think of rich seams, what I'm talking about is, where are we getting misinformation? Where are we being misled? And where do we need to see things more clearly? And I suppose that what I'm going to try to do is force us to do the first two subjects, COVID and Labour, together, right? And I'm going to start, if I might, by asking this sort of simple and broad question, which is Labour doing its job as the opposition? To what extent is it holding the government to account? Well, actually, I won't even predict it. I'm going to ask Matt D'Ancona first. Matt, if you would, what's your read on that, of the extent to which the government is? I see you're in our office.
Hello.
What's your read on the extent to which the government the Labour is doing its job as an opposition?
Well, thanks, James. I guess the best way to frame that is I wrote a piece for Tortoise on the leadership race, in which it was very clear that Starmer was going to win, and the way he was going to win was by posturing as a reformed Corbynite. He was going to shackle himself to the 2019 manifesto, say he had strong feeling still of support for Jeremy Corbyn, and things have gone wrong for various reasons. And I remember asking one of his advisors, what is this? And this advisor said, well, you have to understand this is the only way he can win with the membership system we have. And my follow-up question was, okay, is he a Kinnock or is he a Blair? In other words, does Starmer intend to just steady the ship, stabilise things, make Labour electable again and then move on? Or does he actually want to win an election? The advisor bristled visibly and said, he's a Blair, he's certainly not Neil Kinnock. So to get straight into the pandemic question, at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought Starmer's strategy, which was to basically step aside and let the Johnson government get on with it, was absolutely correct and was consistent with the tactic, which is usually, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, attributed to Napoleon, which is when your enemy is making a mistake, don't interrupt them. But I think things have moved on. That was in March. I think now in September, we have a nation that is not only deeply anxious about the pandemic, but deeply angry about the government's incompetence. And Starmer's strategy on that seems to me to be at best muddled. For example, on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday, Marr pressed him very heavily on whether he would support what measures the government was going to take, which it clearly was going to take this week. And Starmer said repeatedly, yes, we'll support the government, we'll support the government, we'll support the government. Now, under that rubric, he then raised a series of objections. But what you would have taken away from that interview was that there was essentially bipartisanship on the pandemic. And I think this is now becoming a problem. And it reminds me to a certain extent of poor old Ian Duncan Smith in the Iraq War. Now, the difference, I suppose, is that Ian Duncan Smith really did believe in the Iraq War, as did Tony Blair. But I remember at the time, this is in 2003, lots of Tories saying, Ian, you've got to distinguish yourself from the government. You can't just be its cheerleader. And Starmer isn't quite in that predicament, but he's getting quite close. And I think that the time has now come for Labour not just to redefine itself with respect to Corbyn, but also to redefine itself with respect to Johnson. Most of what Starmer's doing at the moment is perfectly creditable work on that front, on sort of making people think that Labour is sane again and is attending to the anti-Semitism problem, which is huge. But what I'd like to hear a lot more of is what it would do differently, how it would handle this pandemic. I mean, there is a basic competence problem now at the centre of the British state. And if Starmer is, as his advisor told me all those months ago, a Blair rather than a Kinnock, he needs to look now like a prospective prime minister. And the great thing Blair did was, from the moment he was elected leader in 1994, was he already looked like he was prime minister. It was just a matter of the formalisation of an election. Starmer's nowhere near that. So I think that that is the big problem, is that he looks to me like someone whose best outcome is that he'll look a plausible leader of the opposition.
Matt, thanks. Chris Cook, what do you think?
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So I think I think starting as I was just looking up the polling actually. Starting as he did with an enormous polling disadvantage and with the Labour Party's brand sort of unprecedentedly trashed by the last 5 years on lots of critical things that we know the Labour Party historically has always had to fix before it gets into government. It's sort of, his mission is to be a sort of steady as she goes sort of politician, I think, at the moment. That when you're in government, you automatically get the benefit of the doubt about competence, and the Labour Party has this historic problem on patriotism, and I think he thinks that by swimming close to them, he'll be able to basically pick up their reflection, but also I think obviously when you behave in a bipartisan manner, there's always the implicit caveat to everything you do, that assuming you're doing things as you say you're doing them, and assuming you're doing things competently. And I think that this sort of minimises the risk to the party of being seen to be opportunistic or whatever. And actually, if you look over his medium-term polling performance, it's sort of a bit sluggish now, but he's already had an extraordinary closing of the gap over the last few months. If you look at the change in the polling average is fairly unprecedented, actually. The speed and sustained nature of the movement. You have to go back to events like the replacement of Michael Foot with Neil Kinnock to find sort of similar sizes of swings. So I think it's all quite reasonable. I mean, I think the idea that I'm a sort of skeptic about the idea that politicians win by setting out sort of detailed prospectuses at the best of times. But I also think there's a good reason, and it's obviously frustrating for political journalists that we don't get things to write about. But he's like the best case study of the benefit of this approach may be Gordon Brown in the early 90s, who supported the government on the decision to enter the European exchange rate mechanism right up until the moment we fell out, when he attacked them for it. And fundamentally, you don't get points for being for like warning of forthcoming doom, but you do lose points if you're seen to be unpatriotic during a crisis. So this, I mean, I think steady as she goes is fine. We think this. I don't think anyone thinks this government's going to have a reputation for competence in a few years, and the sort of bank manageriness of him might work for him.
And Chris, can I ask one thing? I appreciate the point that journalists want politicians to spell out alternative policies, right? But just in a sort of more civic way, right? There is an issue here, which is Rishi Sunak has an agenda that needs to be addressed. What are they going to do about furlough? Is statutory sick pay enough? How do you support people who you're asking to isolate? What are you going to do about sectoral support? Matt Hancock has an agenda, which is how do you create public confidence in vaccines? How do you fix the testing system? Gavin Williamson has an agenda, which is, you may think last summer was a fiasco, but you've got a whole summer coming, and you better start communicating with people now about schools and universities. And I just wonder, I appreciate the point that actually sort of being solid and deliberate has its own attraction politically, but isn't there a responsibility here to actually go after all of these big policy issues and start talking about what needs to be done, offering concrete and clear alternatives?
I think on all of the examples you've given, they have.
Well,
they've got views on the furlough scheme. They've got views. I think they're bonkers on schools. Like, we just have to not have exams next year as well. But but I think they have. We do know what they think on all those things. But they've done it. They've taken the positions in the form of a question. But their questions don't make sense unless you assume they want to, do lots of this stuff.
Just explain to me. So, for example, explain to me furlough, statutory sick pay, sectoral interventions.
Yeah. So they've called for more of the. They've called for extension of the furlough scheme. They just did it again, I think, just now. I'm not sure about sectoral. I haven't looked at what they said on sectoral division. But
and for example, their position on furlough is full opening of the, like, just could roll on the JRS.
Going, you can't turn it off. I don't think they've got I don't think they've set out a sector by sector view.
Right.
But they have highlighted that some sectors are more. I've certainly heard them state that some sectors are more vulnerable than others. So maybe there may be some sectoralness in their response, but they generally said they don't want to turn off the taps.
Right. Okay. Well, I suppose I'll make sure to look into it more closely. Matt, before I'm just going to come to Tarek Sholi in a second, but can I just come back to your one sec? Did you see Tess Murray is saying, well, look, there's no way that Keir Starmer's going to be running against Boris Johnson in 2024 if the election is in 2024. Do you think that's right?
Well, there are. It's certainly more right than it was before COVID struck. Actually, I mean, and I think Boris Johnson's fate is not secure, but you can't operate in opposition on that basis. It is one of the few areas where you do have to move fast and break things. It's almost become a cliche to talk about Blair's clause for a moment, but the reason it became a cliche was because, by doing something as dramatic as he did, which was to turn the top party's back on its commitment to nationalising the economy, he gained a huge amount of public attention. And my worry with Starmer is that I don't think it's enough, particularly for centre-left parties, to assume that they'll win by default. The Labour Party has won very few elections ever. And it's dangerous to assume, let's take the test point, it may well be that Boris Johnson, for reasons of health or party rebellion or a combination of the two, steps down before the next election. Well, that means that Keir Starmer might be up against someone like Rishi Sunak, which is an entirely different proposition. And as Labour found in 1992, when the shiny new leader was none other than the exciting John Major, you can end up losing. So I think you have to be a risk taker to win from opposition. I don't think that rule has changed, and I don't see in Keir Starmer. I see Keir Starmer as, in the great tradition of leaders who clean up the mess made by others. I mean, he's got a lot to be said for him, but he still looks more like a Kinnock than a Blair to me.
Okay, Matt, thank you. I said I come to Tarek. I also want to bring in Andrew Girdwood, because Andrew, I think you're in Scotland, and it may be the most material thing that Labour does between now and the next general election is not actually around Westminster politics as the position it takes on an independence referendum, another independence referendum. So I'm going to come to you in a second, Andrew. But Tarek, first, I'm struck that you're, if I read it right, broadly impressed.
Yeah, I think I am, but it's almost by dint of him not doing much, and it's in comparison with the sort of hapless government in place. I think, unfortunately, or fortunately for him, perhaps, but the advice on Napoleon's side of waiting for them to carry on making yet more mistakes is probably going to be helpful, because I think if we've got 18 months of this still coming, the right time to go for the jugular may be a little bit further down the line.
There was a great moment, Tarek, wasn't there, in the summer around the Dominic Cummings debate. I was speaking to someone in the leader's office and asking who were they planning to put up on Dominic Cummings the following day. This is the leader of the opposition, and they'd said we were planning to put up Michael Gove, and you can see that there's an element of that playing out right now.
But I mean, the risk is to Matthew's point. The risk is that his own party take him out, and and they come out of a credible alternative.
Yeah. Well, listen. Thank you. I'm gonna go to Andrew just on Scotland. I'm gonna come to my colleague Merritt B. Mills, because I'm loving her enthusiasm for Starmer, something you wouldn't necessarily have seen coming. Andrew Girdwood, though, first, do you want to just talk through? I'm slightly confused by the comment you've made in the chat, because I hadn't seen Keir Starmer say anything as clear as supporting the idea of a second referendum. So do you want to just talk us through that?
Sure. There has just been a vote of no confidence in the Labour leader here in Scotland, yes, on the grounds that nobody knows who the hell he is. And honestly, I can't remember his name right now.
Richard Leonard, I think is his name.
That's right. Okay, you're better than me. And he survived, I think, by the skin of his teeth. And I think a few days after that, Keir Starmer said that the idea of a second referendum should be looked at. So I suppose the phrasing is important there.
Right.
I mean, Labour need to win Scotland back if they want to take on the UK, right? I mean, that's often was the core of their wins in yesteryears, and they just don't, not even the second party in Scotland anymore. So I think it's conceivable that Keir Starmer will flirt with the idea of offering greater devolution to Scotland in order to shore up the Labour vote, and I think that will have potentially profound impacts on the UK.
I think, Andrew, so one of my favourite columnists, probably at work today in the UK, is Rachel Sylvester. To be honest, I hired her in when I was working at the Times, and she writes columns that I love because they've got a point of view, but almost always in the third or fourth column of them, there's like this sudden moment where it's like, hang on, that's a massive piece of news, isn't it? And if you look at hers this morning, she makes the argument exactly as you're making, which Labour has to win Scotland. She then goes on and says, there's a question and a choice for Starmer, right, which is, do you back the idea of a second referendum, but make the case for the union and set as a prerequisite for that referendum that the terms of the departure are preset, i.e. Scotland knows, for example, issues of currency, etc. And then in an almost throwaway line, but she obviously is not throwing it away, is that this is not dissimilar from the view that Michael Gove is said to be taking within the kind of, Conservative cabinet. And if that's the case, if there is really a debate, particularly someone like Michael Gove, who knows his way around Scottish politics a fair bit, is beginning to toy with the second referendum, there is something here that's creeping up quite fast, I think, and probably worth us looking at. As I say, it's more meaningful in a material way in the short term, probably, than what happens in terms of the polls. But Andrew, thank you for flagging that up. I'm going to look at the language specifically because I hadn't seen it. Chris, have you got an amazing graph that we need to see?
It's potentially quite an incomprehensible graph.
That's my favourite kind.
If I share my screen.
Yeah, that'd be good.
There we are. Right. So can you see my screen?
Not yet.
What about now?
Sam, can you see if you can just share Chris's screen?
I'm doing it. Sorry.
Are you doing? Okay.
This is not the smoothest of operations, but I think it's. Hang on a minute. I've almost figured this out. This is seamless. This one. Right. So this is so this graph is a frequency distribution for the change in how the opposition party did in comparison to the governing party on a sort of weekly basis, going back to 2005, I think. So or maybe earlier. About 2005, right? So the point of it is it shows that in the middle, you can see it peaks around 0. So in the average week, the weekly change, when you sort of smooth out polling averages and everything else, the weekly change is basically 0 normally. There are weeks when it goes up a bit. You can see there are individual weeks where it's gone up more than 5 points, and there are individual weeks when it's dropped by more than 5 points in a single week. But the idea is to show you what a normal week looks like in terms of movement. And the red line is the last week for the Labour Party. So you can see it slightly dropped in the last week. So it's not had a great week, but it's not a sort of exceptionally unusual one. If you look at 3-week periods, so you start, rather than using single week movements, you start looking at 3-week movements, you see you get much bigger movements because it's obviously over a longer time. So you can get a few weeks of where people move by more than 10 weeks over a 3-week period. And actually, you don't get any 3-week periods when everyone's dropped by more than 10 points in the opposition.
And sorry, Chris, can you just explain something? So the left and right of the red line are the number of percentage points that they've moved in polling terms.
In the parties, how much the gap between the parties changes between the opposition and the government. So the point is really, if you have, what it tells you is, if you've gone up by 5 points, if you close the gap by 5 points over a 3-week period, so you're up here, you're going really well.
Yeah.
And if you're up by 5 points, that's an unusually terrible few weeks.
And then what does the 0.1, 0.2 mean?
It's a frequency distribution. So don't ignore that. Just look at the shape. Like, if you look at 6-week periods, I've marked in all of the Starmer 6-week periods. You can see actually he's had a few not good 6-week periods. These ones here at the left, but for the most part, he's doing very. He's had really good scores. And if you go out to 10 weeks, he's scoring exceptionally well. And the reason for doing this is to point out that when you're looking at the noise in the polls, it's sometimes quite easy to get dragged into sort of micro-directional things. And when you look on a week-by-week basis, he looks like he's not doing that well. But actually, when you look at a longer time frame, when you look at 10-week periods, he's had a sequence of them that are extraordinarily strong, one after another. So this is really remarkably strong polling performance. He's seen an enormous shift in the Labour Party. Has seen enormous improvement in the Labour Party's aggregate position, which you sometimes miss when you look at the lines shifting up and down. What this tells you is that he's had a really actually pretty remarkable first few months as leader, and part of that I think is the natural rebound from Corbyn and the unwinding of some of the unusual coalitions that have emerged over the last 2 elections. But like I find it very hard to say that this is a guy who doesn't know what he's doing, or like he's pursuing the wrong strategy, given that he's doing spectacularly well when you smooth off the edges of the polling averages. Sort of sensational performance.
Okay, that is an incomprehensible graph made actually comprehensible.
The other dots, the other ones here, are Corbyn's 2017 general election performance and Neil Kinnock taking over from Michael Foot. Actually, Michael Foot one isn't in there, but that's the only one that's comparable from before this period. The other blue dots are the middle of the Labour general election campaign in 2017, to give you a sense of how fast some of this movement has been.
Right. And Chris, thank you. So Merope, your mum is making an important appearance.
First of all, James, was that sarcasm before when you said you couldn't see that?
No,
I'm sorry, I'm so predictable.
No. I hadn't. No. My point was he hadn't seemed. He didn't feel. Hasn't felt a particularly inspiring person. I mean, and maybe.
Okay. So I haven't got an incomprehensible graph.
Yeah.
But I have got a little anecdote, which is to say, Keir Starmer used to live on my road with his partner, and height of lockdown, we in our road were doing what we call gin by the bin, which is, margaritas at 2 meters, whatever, just a drink with your neighbours in the street. And he's still friends with his partner who he lived on my road with, and which I think says something nice about him and her as well. But I was saying, I'm a bit worried about him. I'm worried about his sort of lack of, and it's quite hard to say, it's worried about your ex-boyfriend's lack of charisma, as a leader, given in the age of Trump and the age of, Boris or whatever. And she said to me, don't you think that is what is needed now? Don't you think that is what this mood will call for? And as months have gone on, I've just come to completely agree with her. I was also watching PMQs in that little break between our meeting and this meeting. And, I've come to really love the way that he doesn't crack a smile at any of Boris's stupid jokes in the middle of the Commons. And it feels like his statesman-like performance is exactly what you want right now, because you don't want jokes. And I have to say, I just was looking at the last couple of lines from his, or a few lines from his speech, which I got for here. While Boris was writing flippant columns about bendy bananas, I was defending victims and persecuting terrorists. When he was sacked by a newspaper for making up claims, I was fighting for justice and the rule of law. I just think there is something to be said about the contrast between the two people. And as I was saying in the chat, my mum, who has never voted Labour in her entire life, has only ever voted Tory, and in times that she didn't like Tory, voted Lib Dems, said, oh, I like that Keir Starmer. And so I feel like, apropos Chris's incomprehensible graph, he is cutting through to people.
Can I just ask you one other thing, right? So one of the things that we, on that basis, is I'm really interested that he gets on well with his former partner, right? I really am.
Anecdote. Yeah, I know, it's interesting, isn't it?
And I don't understand where we've got to in how much we should know about the private lives of our political leaders.
Well, I feel like I'm not disclosing. I'm worried she's just like, my back garden door's open and she says she works in her garden, so she's probably like 4 doors down listening to this. But I don't think it's not a bad thing to get on with. It's a good thing, isn't it? And I don't
No. I'm just
anything.
I know, I'm just interested. I'm massively interested, right? I do think that there was a whiff of this in the papers over the weekend about the extent to which Boris Johnson's private life is impacting his working life. And Matt and I have been talking for a while about this sort of upstairs, downstairs dynamic in Downing Street, right? It is really relevant to how, this line that keeps on coming in that, Marina was a very different force in his life from Carrie. I just think all that is really interesting. Anyway, Marika, I'm very excited about the new phrase "gin by the bin." I didn't know about that. I'm going to get right into it.
You can have it for the next lockdown, James.
It's coming. I just want to ask Edwin, is it Edwin McGarity? Edwin, if you're there, you just made it seem to me a really kind of important point about the way in which Labour speaks to its different constituent parts. And when you say there's going to need to be someone in Labour who speaks to the left and speaks to the momentum Corbyn wing of the party, when you look at the current lineup, who do you think that might be?
I really don't know. That's the problem. I don't think that he has been able to kind of consolidate his position, because the left are sitting in the background and you really don't know where they're going to throw the next bomb.
Yeah.
And so I think that what I always had looked at the Blair years is that you had this guy who spoke to the right, this guy seemed to keep the banks happy, and then you had Prescott, who stood up at every of the big get-togethers and told the Labour people, do you want this or do you want the other guys? And it kept them in line. There is nobody in this kind of level speaks to the normal kind of Labour guy. They just feel that everybody else ignores what they want. And they have this old-fashioned idea that they can charge in and get things. And it just doesn't happen that way.
Just out of interest though, you don't think, Edwin, that Angela Rayner can do that for them?
I haven't seen anything in the things to say that happens yet, no.
Yeah. Zav, can I just bring you on that? What do you think?
Sorry?
No, I was just going to ask Zav, who's a colleague of mine, and I was just interested to pick up on that point, on how that part of the Labour Party that is, doesn't want to feel like it's been forgotten, and is also dangerous when it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I know certainly they're not very happy with Starmer's speech. I think they didn't like that he focused on family values and focused on patriotism. They saw it as fighting Boris on his own ground rather than carving out, their own path. I mean, it's clear that over the next 5 years or the next 4 years, the crises which they are really worried about are going to get worse. Climate change is going to get worse. I think issues like Black Lives Matter, which they're also concerned with, are going to get worse. These were all things which they said that Starmer could have talked about and didn't talk about. So I don't know whether there would be a breakaway movement, but I think they are not going away. They are still a big part of the membership. And I think at some point, Starmer's going to have to deal with them, or there's every chance they could, I suppose, if they wanted to, become a spoiler party separately.
And Zav, you, just out of interest, are you disappeared by a kind of, the critique of Starmer would be he's managerial. He is, he's managerial. He's North London. He is, in that sense, and he's and in the speech in particular, he's embracing something that seems, you would say, patriotic. Some would say a more populist version of the Labour position. Are you disappointed with the amount that they're junking?
I mean, it's hard to say because in opposition, it's unclear. You know, I think Starmer can carve out strong positions, say on Black Lives Matter, which I think he failed to do, on climate change, which I mean Labour failed to do that in the last election. But ultimately, what power does he have anyway to kind of change the needle on those things? Like if he talks about Black Lives Matter, then I think you know the newspapers and probably the Tory party would pick that up as a stick to beat him with. And you could say in that case, he's done the principled thing, he's done the right thing, he's talked about something which I think should concern us. But if it's just going to lead to more unpopularity, so I think everyone's kind of grappling between do we want him to be a kind of pragmatic person in opposition, or do we want him to be a principled person in opposition? And when the election is 4 years away, it's hard to say which is the better one to be.
Yeah. Listen, I know we could talk about this for ages. I do think it's pointed us in a couple of interesting directions. One is specifically Scotland. Two is I do think that Edwin's point, though, about not just Starmer but the team is really worth looking at. I'm struck in the chat by how many people are pointing out what they thought of Angela Rayner at PMQ. Certainly that was my impression, similar to others there. And also, you know, I'm really taken by Chris' point on the polls, which I guess was what Matt was saying too, which is it's working. So, you know, there's a lot to digest there. I just want to, before we go to this question about the UN, I'm going to come to Charles Patel and Nini Harper in a sec on what we think about global leadership and specifically the UN. But Dave Taylor, Dave, are you there? Just because there was a moment in the thinking last night, I think it was last night, when you were talking to Bill Kristol, and I was really struck listening to Bill Kristol, who frankly had his head in his hands about the state of the Republican Party. People know Kristol worked for Reagan, worked for George H.W. Bush. It was one of the sort of leading conservative pundits in the United States. Joined us last night to discuss whether or not democracy was in danger in the US, and made the argument that the institutions of government had actually held up pretty well. His despair was around the Republican Party and the idea of a Republican Party that had become more populist, had become more anti-immigrant, had become more intolerant. And it was just striking listening to him, thinking how fast parties change depending on their leaders and how much might change. And I just wondered what your reflections were just before we turn to the sort of global picture on the US picture. There you are. Hello. You're in the newsroom under the clock, so you're both
unintentional Wes Anderson background. Everything's perfect symmetry. It's all you can pour all of that into a single vessel, and its name is Lindsey Graham. You know, the journey that he has been on. The South Carolina senator, you know, who was a sort of fellow traveller with John McCain and was seen to be, a so-called decent Republican. You know, I can recall seeing him in a room giving the most sort of vituperative and hilarious speech, destroying Trump in mid-2016. And you would think he would have held fast to his principles, but you know, sadly he seems to have become the absolute epitome of the go along to get along Republican, and he's now the golf buddy and enabler for Trump. And you know, again, I mean, much is being made of his well documented quotes from 2016, where he stood in the way of an Obama pick for the Supreme Court, and he's saying, use these remarks against me, use my words against me. But even if it was a Republican in election year, it's too close. And here he is with 40 days to go. He's the chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, and he's the one who is going to carry water for Trump when he makes his nomination. And I think if you're someone like Bill Kristol, no one would say he has a record that is that is invulnerable to scrutiny. He's a neocon, and he was an intellectual weight behind everything that happened in the George W. Bush era. But you can see he's a guy who actually stands for some things and has a golden thread going through his politics. And I think what you've seen with Graham and McConnell and others is that actually it's just about power, and they've been willing to accept this hostile takeover of their party. And I think he was saying last night that the demagoguery and the nationalism can easily survive Trump. I think he estimated to us that he thought that there were maybe 10% of the Republican Party that were renegades, and 90% of them have fallen into line with Trump. So it's very hard to get out from under that, I think.
It is, yeah. I'm caught between whether or not there's a structural shift in the dynamics of the Republican Party, or there's just a cravenness amongst politicians around power, and and the first feels like a lot of long words, and the second one feels good. But Dave, can I ask you one other thing? One of the things you did last year was just kept on saying, we've got to do a thing on Kamala Harris, right? We've got to find a way of getting into the US election cycle early and say something that'll last, right? And you were the one who said, let's commission a piece on Kamala Harris, because it's really not just about her, it's about the outlook of the Democrat Party, right? This is very unfair, but if you were a US version of Tortoise and we were sitting in Washington and you were saying, look, the UK is clearly being consumed by incompetence of government and its response to COVID, Brexit and its new relationship with the world, and the potential breakup of the union as a subject that comes up again. And you would say, let's commission a piece of slow journalism about a thing or a person.
Yeah.
I'm struck by Edwin's point. I'm like, oh, is it Angela Rayner? Is that the story that we do? Or is it Graham Brady?
Andy, maybe.
Or is it Graham Brady? Is it who is it? I'm going to cheat, because I'm going to do something. I'm going to give you 12 and a half minutes to think of the correct answer to that question, or the brilliant answer to it. And I'm going to come back at the end, because I'd love to. We have a think.
All right, very good.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to have a think. Okay, come up with a couple, would be grand. All right, so listen. UN General Assembly, we never get to talk about the UN General Assembly. I had to go and cover a fair few UN General Assemblies, and I was always told they were going to make the front page when I got there, and they always ended up below the fold, bottom of page 5, once I had gone and done the story. So I want to make sure we have a proper think about what we make of the UN at 75. I've asked really Giles and Imi to think it through. On the one hand, happy birthday. On the other hand, happy birthday and retire. Imi, do you want to go first with happy birthday and retire? Why the UN's no longer fit to do the things we want to do?
Sure. So I thought quite a good example to draw on is something that I saw happen earlier on in the summer. So I'm sure people were aware that COP26 was meant to be taking place this November up in Glasgow, and actually one of my friends was working on that team because she's a civil servant. And then when the pandemic struck, the UN were like, or I guess Britain said, sorry, we're going to postpone it to 2021. And this is all about climate change and countries coming together to agree ways to tackle climate change. And what I noticed recently on Twitter was something that's happening in November this year is something called Mock COP26, which is essentially like a bunch of young activists all coming together, and they're doing what the UN should be doing. Like, have they not heard of Zoom? Yeah. They can still meet and they can still sort of come up with action plans. It's quite ironic because obviously the UN was founded in California, and California is currently on fire. So it's just like they haven't brought themselves up to speed with the 21st century. So I just think it's got too big, and they don't really know like what their priorities are.
And so you would replace it with nothing. You would say, look, actually, we can have groups come together around issues to fix this, rather than having, I saw William Jeremy's made the point about international bodies underpinned by treaty.
Yeah, I just think that if you ask the average person in the street, what's the UN for? I don't think anyone would answer security and peace. I think a lot of the times you see them in the news with doing humanitarian aid, and I think that is something that they do a good job at. But I think they've got too big, they have too many organisations which cross over, they're all competing for different funding, and so they're not working together. They're headquartered in like Geneva and New York, which are two very expensive cities, and then they don't actually get anywhere with anything.
Okay, I'm gonna come back to him in a second. I want to hear Charles's argument on the other side.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
James, I'm not at all surprised that none of your stories made the front page. And it's not about you, it's about the UN, right? Just a couple of quick stories. 10 years ago, Haiti, earthquake, totally destroyed, between 80 and 300,000 dead. The one institution that held the place together was MINUSTA, the combined UN presence there. Without it, it would have been complete anarchy. With it, there was a place for the government to be, and there was crucially coordination for the literally hundreds of relief agents pouring in. Médecins Sans Frontières and the Israelis provided the glamour, but without the UN coordination, it would have been utter chaos. And that kind of work during and between disasters is going on all over the world, all the time, mainly through its agencies, WHO, WFP, Pakistan after the earthquake, Sudan almost continuously, Mozambique after the floods. World Food Programme has been on the ground for literally 2 generations in Afghanistan, feeding people who have no other way of getting fed. And right now, as we put in SenseMaker this morning, 60 nations, excluding the US and China, 60 rich nations have joined the COVAX vaccine coordination program for COVID. Who's running that? WHO. It's largely unglamorous, which is why it's unreported. Most of this work is not happening in New York, Geneva, or Rome, where fancy people and reporters live and work, but it's still essential. One other very quick point. I've played the old man card. Here's the young man card. The other day, a friend of one of my kids arrived in my house. He was absolutely delightful, far more organized, cheerful, and focused than any of my own children. And he's a very good cook. He had come to cook a large curry for a large number of people, not including me. My wife said, "So what do you want to do when you leave university?" "I want to work for the UN," right? He, at least, sample size of 1, had been inspired by what it was doing. Yes, I grant, peacekeepers in Africa have committed horrendous crimes. Kofi Annan's son got a Mercedes in dodgy circumstances, as the Times' very own James Bone spent years revealing. UN Security Council has been held to ransom by Russia and China for a generation. The UN's human rights work is often a self-parody. But its total budget is less than half the annual budget of the NHS. Total. That is why for much of its emergency spending, it has to do emergency fundraising. The fact that it is not national on the one hand, nor a bunch of NGOs on the other, is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, you would have no body to do that coordinating role that had the consent of 170 nations, all of whom, by the way, will be dialing in to the virtual UNGA this year. And for all those reasons, I say that if it didn't exist, you would have to invent it, and it does exist. So tearing it down and trying to invent something else is a waste of time.
So what do you do then, Giles? Just about the one central thing that's really been on my mind about this for the last 10 days has been this point that Samantha Power made when we did the G7 Billion Summit, right? Which was, look, it's really difficult if you're Antonio Guterres, right? It's really difficult if you're Tedros at the WHO, because you've got a pulpit from which you can make provide commentary on the government of the United States or China or elsewhere, but these people are the ones that provide your funding. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, we've essentially established an organization that we want to be able to stand up for the human interest globally, right? But we've also made it completely subject to the interests and powers of those big superpowers, and we've made their lives impossible. And the result is that, you know, when push comes to shove, when the moment is now, you don't hear from Antonio Guterres. Not Antonio.
Yeah. Well, it's true. It's partly because we're not listening. I mean, and there's no doubt that there's a comms job that they can do better there.
It's more than a comms job, though, isn't it? It's actually about having an independent authority. I mean, the fact is that I'll come back to you in a second, Amy, but the fact is that these guys are essentially shackled by their relationships with their funders.
Yeah. And never more true than in the WHO's sort of bilateral relationship with China. That's absolutely true. But ask yourself what the alternative is.
Because that's what I am asking you. I'm asking you if you really believe in it, and I'm not asking you in a sort of kind of faux debating room where I'm saying, okay, let's say that in our hearts we're really persuaded by your arguments, Haiti, etc. But actually, how do you get behind the UN? How do you actually give it some power to get on and do the things that it needs to do?
You give it the money that it needs, which is not a great deal more than it has at the moment, and it gets on and does it. It is doing it. That's the point I'm trying to make. The independent authority that you're talking about would very quickly and very properly be rejected because nobody's asking for world governance. And I'm not supporting world governance. We're talking about world capacity. That's what's required. You're looking for a technocratic organization that can get stuff done. And Imi, I take your point about the laughable slowness in adopting social media to compensate for the difficulties of COVID. But in a lot of parts of the world, the UN's work is just not about social media. It's about trucks and sacks of grain.
Mm-hmm. Imi, do you want to come back on that? And then I just want to go to Luke Bedemer, if I can, just on this point about the delay to COP.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to create sort of a new UN, I think one of the key things that they should do is just making everyone equal, all the countries, all the member states equal. Because if you've got the Security Council and the likes of the US and China and Russia, having that veto ability and stopping important stuff happening because Russia want to do different things in Syria to what the States wants to do, then we're not going to get anywhere. And so I just think it needs a huge revamp, but they've been trying to reform it since the 90s and we're still where we are.
Okay, Luke, will you just explain? I didn't understand your point about the impact of the delay. You made a point in the chat.
Yeah, it was about a specific part of the Paris rulebook, which was one of the things to be negotiated and potentially finalised at COP26. And it's been a very difficult part of that, which is Article 6 of the Paris rulebook, which is meant to set up a carbon market. And there was an interesting bit of data work that was done in the lead up towards the cancellation that showed that that Article 6 was actually going backwards in terms of its negotiatedness. So what they do is they bracket or unbracket clauses in the rulebook when they've been agreed. And this part was on a trend towards being, so more bracketed, so more unresolved. And I think that is possible that was because constituent nations were having more time to sort of pick it apart and think about how it was going to cost them individually. And this delay is going to offer more opportunity to do that and potentially sort of hamstring the whole thing. And there's an agreement in place that if all the articles can't be resolved, then the rulebook is not going to stand, which is a serious issue.
And the delay by a year puts all that in play.
Yeah, perhaps even more than a year, in that countries will work out the sort of medium to long term costs to their own interests and be even less willing to agree. Whereas they may be needed to get it done in the moment. I'm not sure about that part, but
okay. Luke, thank you. I'm going to wind up, but I'm going to do just a few things. One is I just wanted to flag up Richard Curtis, who you know is the filmmaker, has come and done a number of things with us. He's made a film about the United Nations at 75, which Chris Cook and Giles flagged up in this morning's Sensemaker. Do take a look at it. I think part of the argument here is about how you effectively get government and public behind the UN. Call it out as you say, Amy, for what it's doing wrong, but then call it out for what it's doing right and give it some support. I wanted to just flag up a couple of things that we're doing this week, or we have been doing this week. Is I'm really conscious of the extent to which the news is just washing over us at quite such speed. What's happened? What's the latest on the lockdown? You know, who said what to whom? And using opinion in our sense maker to make clear what Tortoise is interested in, but also where both our members, our contributors, and our colleagues in the newsroom stand, really seems more worthwhile than ever. And so we can. Jim O'Neill, who joined us at the G7 Billion Summit, offered a point of view on changing the terms of reference for the Bank of England in yesterday's SenseMaker, arguing that not just inflation, but growth should be the mandate of the Bank of England. And this may seem small and technocratic. It's a massive change in what you ask a bank to do, with really significant impacts on government and society. And Jim O'Neill, the person who was, as an economist, came up with the idea of BRICS, is one of those few economists that people actually listen to. We ran that as an opinion yesterday. Today, Liz Mosley, fellow editor and partner at Tortoise, has written a blistering piece on what it's like to go and try and get a test. I won't spoil the ending, but I will say that she went, tried, and failed to get a test. And so it's an extraordinary statement about the gap between what the government says is happening and what is actually happening. So do please take a look. I say that to everyone because this is our open news meeting. Having those opinions, informed opinions, not rushed opinions, but informed opinions, feels really valuable. Please do weave them in. We just had a group meeting, and one of the things that, in fact, Luke was flagging up was, how do we make sure that we are not just, if you like, having conversations in the choir, that we're talking about things that we're likely to agree in the first place. We have a thinking on Thursday night, which is whether we should be ashamed of Winston Churchill, right? And part of the interest there is the extent to which people are upset by the tearing down of Churchill, and the extent to which social justice, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd also challenges heroes in history and damages a sense of nationhood and identity. And so I want to make sure that we are really engaged in that. It should be a difficult conversation. It does seem to me as though Boris Johnson's claim that we've had enough cringing embarrassment in our history is preposterous, feels as though we haven't had nearly enough. But to hear both or the many different sides of that is a really important argument. And then having the capacity to look from the outside in at our own politics and our own country is something that I hope that we're doing. We're doing it this week in the big file on long COVID. I hope that you felt as though we did it properly last week in our really, really thoughtful and deep look at what's at work in the United States. And in that spirit, Dave, I come back to you to have the last word. What should be the long-term commissions on UK politics that would make sense of it?
Well, again, I mean, looking at why did we alight on Kamala Harris? I think the reason she seemed so gripping to me was that she was the polar opposite of Trump. She was fiercely intelligent. She was an African-American woman. You got a boorish white man who seemed to revel in ignorance, and so that was it, I suppose. And so you're kind of asking yourself, who can be the antidote to the sheer lack of integrity, decency, intelligence that's been in play in the UK. So in 12 and a half minutes, it's an eclectic bunch. But I'm going to say, I'll start with Marcus Rashford.
Nice.
Think, why the hell not? You know, there's a person who stood up in the public square and stood for something in this moment. Personal to me, I'm obsessed with her books, and I think she's piercing about where we are as a nation, and also at the same time warm about humanity. Ali Smith, I think her books are amazing, and I think she has a lot to say about politics in that Four Seasons quartet. You know, I mean, the Prince Across the Water, David Miliband, is someone who I think, you know, a lot of people still hold a torch for, and even if he's not coming back to rescue British politics, does he speak to a better iteration of it, and have a good understanding of the fact that it's not just you know, elected members who can solve problems. And what about Theresa May? What about if we went back to look forward? Is she having a moment as the keeper of the flame for something decent? You know, erstwhile worst prime minister in recent history, and here she is standing up for something.
It is. I'll leave you with something to think about, Dave. Then maybe for the whole week. I had. By the way, Nico, just to say, thank you so much for the suggestions on speakers. That's also really helpful. Obviously, we had Jim O'Neill 10 days ago, and Jimmy Wales too, and Mariana we had a few weeks back, but we haven't had Matt Ridley and we haven't had Phil Mullen, and we will make sure to seek them out too. I had a very depressing thought over the weekend, which I couldn't work out who the public figure was that had the stature and importance emotionally right now in the UK of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and we must have some. We just got to figure out who they are. But that we can pick up next week. For now, listen, thank you everyone for joining us. A lot for us to think about. We've got our afternoon commissioning meeting. We'll take those ideas and feed them in, and a long-term planning session tomorrow. So again, this will inform all of that. Thanks for your time, everyone. Have a very good afternoon. The sunshine might not last long, so go out and enjoy it. All the best.